Well, hello friends and welcome to Ask Zach. Today we're going to talk about what I think is probably the best transistorized amp of all time, and that's the Lab series. Today we've got a L9, which is the model with a 15-inch EV in it. But yeah, today we're going to talk about Lab series, a little bit about the history, and talk about some of the players, and I'm going to talk about the funny story about me finding this amp and me thinking something was wrong with the amp and getting a discount on it, and then finding out that there was nothing wrong with it, and then, making things right with the store. So yeah, so we've got a fun, action-packed episode for you today. Before we dive in, just have to say thank you to all my Patreon members, because they are the gasoline that keeps this engine running, and I'm very appreciative of them. So thank you guys. If you'd like to join them in supporting the show, there's a link in the description. Also, there's merch like this amp schematic shirt, or you can get a coffee mug. There's also tip jar information. So all support is appreciated. I read all the comments. I appreciate, a thumbs up. And yeah, thank you. Let's dive in. So many times people will incorrectly say that the Lab series was a Gibson amp, and that's not true. The fact is that Norlin, that owned Gibson, also owned Moog, and they decided to start up Lab series, but it was not a Gibson amp, and it was purposefully not a Gibson amp, and that's because Gibson had never been successful with their amp line. So from, time eons going back, I mean, maybe they were somewhat popular in the, their earlier designs, maybe in the 30s or 40s, but by the 50s, they were just getting killed by Leo Fender. And they kept coming up with different designs. They even kind of followed suit and kind of copied Fender in some ways, but they were just never able to have a successful amp line. They were never able to have a Princeton or a Champ or a Twin or a Vibrolux or any of those. And so as it is, the cosmetics changed every couple of years, amp names changed a lot, and they just had a bunch of different models through the years. And by the mid-70s, Norlin was kind of like, okay, let's try something completely different. So they decided to not use the Gibson name, and this was going to be a different division, and Lab series was started. And to me, it makes sense, being that the guys that are in a synthesizer company with Moog to design it, that because it was coming from the crazy labs of the the synth lab, as it were. But they firmly had their feet in kind of tradition in another sense. So it's kind of cutting edge. It has one channel of cutting edge, but then there's all these other factors, aesthetic and otherwise, that are very much a nod to Fender. So, because you can't escape the influence of Fender and just how, I mean, they were the amp leader, the 50s, 60s, and 70s. So with the Lab series amp, what do you get? Well, you get a cabinet that looks just like a Fender cabinet, except the Tolex on it is a little bit kind of brown colored, but it's the same type of shape. It's the same, with this, cut here, and the fact that the control panel is kind of angled, and you have the 2-channel layout just like a Fender Twin or Super Reverb. You've got 2 inputs. You've got a bright, switch on both sides. You've got this kind of basic EQ here, just like a Fender would have, like a Twin Reverb would have on its first channel. But then, of course, this side is where you get all of the differences, and of course the output section that has the compressor. So yeah, so there was a big nod to Fender and tradition to make it to where, they weren't going to come up with some amp that had a completely out of this world look to it, because they were going to have a hard enough time, being that it was kind of a high-end transistorized amp, and high-end it was. So at the time, it was around $650, which in today's money, that's around $2,500. So $2,500 that's really getting into, kind of hand-wired or boutique world, or, kind of your more expensive amplifiers. So, it was not on the low end. A lot of interesting, cool features. One, you have these, you know, the inputs say high and low, but they're completely counterintuitive. So the high is padded, and that's where you would put a high gain pickup. And the low, of course, is for a low gain pickup, and it's much higher output. Yeah, it's gained up. You have your normal bright switch. Of course, I'm missing two knobs here that I found a guy on the Lab Series Facebook page named Gavin up in Canada that was kind enough to sell me two knobs that are headed this way, and so thank you to Gavin. Yeah, so you've got volume, bass, mid-range, treble, again, just like a good old Fender amp. Then, you know, this channel is where you have all of the differences. But let's hear this other channel real quick. So, you know, very Fendery sounding. Let's see. Bright switch. Yeah, very Fendery. And again, this was an amp that was designed with, you know, high-end components, high-end transistors, you know, has big heat sink on the back, has a big, you know, big output transformer. I mean, there was no expense, you know, spared in designing this amp and making it sound as good as it could, because again, you were competing against, you know, some great tube amps, you know, of the day. Let's go to channel 2, and this is again where you get kind of the magic of the Lab Series amp and why, you know, people tend to like them. You've got, again, the high and low inputs. You've got the bright switch, which I have on. You've got a volume control, which is kind of like your preamp volume, bass. And this is where things get really different, is you have this frequency and mid-range knob. The mid-range knob at 0 up at noon, it's neutral. And as you turn it to the right, it's boosting. And as you turn it to the left, it's cutting. Then the frequency knob controls the frequency of mid-range that you either boost or cut. So it has everything from 100 hertz to 6.4 kilohertz. So you have very low mids to very high mids. And right now I have it set at 400, and I have it just slightly boosting some. But just so you can hear it, what it's doing, I'm gonna set it up to like pretty heavy boost, and then I'm gonna twist it around. I like it about 400, but anywhere in between 400 and 1.6 is really cool to add to it. It just depends on how much nose you want on your mid-range. So obviously if you go up to 1.6, you know, you get more of a high mid versus the. I kind of prefer the 400, but it just depends on what you like. Of course, good old treble knob. Then you've got this multi-filter. And so this was kind of, again, them trying, the Moog synthesizer designers trying to make an amp that sounded more tube-like. And so they wanted something that added kind of more high harmonics. And that's kind of what it does. So I have it set up on 6, but here, you know. So yeah, sounds good. Then the reverb is straight up Fender. I mean, it just, you know, 2.5 is the golden spot, you know, for most players. And then of course you start getting above that, it starts getting pretty surfy. Or all the way. back to 2.5. Then, besides, of course, the frequency, mid-range, and multi-filter, the other big thing is the compressor, which I've had on the whole time, but at a fairly low setting. Now here's well, actually it's a fairly high setting. So this is where I got into trouble the other day at the music store. But again, I'm going to tell that story in a minute. But this is counterintuitive. So as you turn the compressor down, it gets more compressed. And as you turn it up, it's less compressed. And it's very interactive with the master control. So you're going to have to reset your compression level if you turn up the master. And but it's not like it's hard to do. It's just if you turn up the master, you kind of end up having to kind of turn up the compressor, which of course turns down the level of compression. Here I'll just say that you know, the way guys use the compressor, you know, a lot of guys will use it in a very subtle way, but you know, some guys will use it a little more, you know, a little less subtle, a little more in your face. One of the guys that kind of uses it a little bit more is Ricky Skaggs, and his one of his old guitar techs told me that he would set it to where when he would play, when he would bend, when he would pop the B string and use the bender at the same time, he wanted it to light up. So there you can hear that kind of sound. So, and then again, as you turn the master up, you probably have to turn the compressor down. The amp can get, you know, some pretty good dirty sounds. So I'm going to turn the master down some. I'm going to turn the compressor off. So, and it's got a little more. I mean, yeah, you can. So, you know, when I think of these amps, I think of Ray Flacke and Ricky Skaggs, which, you know, of course, used these religiously throughout the, you know, the 80s and early 90s and past it. I mean, Ray Flacke started using one in the late 70s, and he liked it because it was the only amp that he could find that when he had the high strings sounding nice, you know, and fat on a Telecaster, that it didn't get woolly in the low end. Does that make sense? Where, you know, you get it to where these strings sound really good, and then all of a sudden you get down here and it's too flubby, it's too woofy, and it just got too much stuff going on. And so he really liked the lab amp because it just holds together well, and it's able to sound fat on the high strings without it being a bunch of nonsense on the low end. But Ray used the Lab series, you know, through his time with Ricky Skaggs and session work and touring with Marty Stewart and other people, and you know, of course, his, you know, instrumental albums that he did. And I love Ray, and Ray's a good guy, and yeah, and hello, Ray, if you're watching. We need to, you know, we need to get the clan together again soon. But yeah, this is a cool amp. And of course, when Ricky Skaggs took over, when Ray left the band, and when Ricky took over, he used the same amp. You know, he played a Telecaster, you know, with a B bender, which Ray did not. Ray didn't need a B bender. Ricky used the B bender, you know, Glazer Telly, like similar to this, and used one of these Lab Series amps. And both of them used an echo. You know, Ray would used either an Echoplex or a Deluxe Memory Man, and then of course he stopped using echo altogether. Ricky tended to use a Deluxe Memory Man or a Roland Space Echo, but yeah, that was their thing. Of course, there are many other great players that have used the Lab Series amp through the years. probably one of the biggest proponents of it was B.B. King, who of course started using it in the late 70s, probably because of the the Norlin ownership of Gibson and Lab Series. He was probably given one, and so he used the L5, which is the 212 version, and he preferred that over Fender amps, throughout his career up until his passing, and he always preferred using a Lab Series amp. And it's the thing about the Lab Series amp; it's very controllable, and the dirtiness that it gets and the way you're able to really control the mid-range. I mean, it's a really great amp, and I could see why B.B. King would prefer that over, especially if you were in any kind of situation where you're using rental gear. So the other guys, of course, Alan Holdsworth used them for a while. Tabor with King's X was a famous proponent of at least using the preamp on Lab amps. And Lab kind of went away by the mid 80s, but then one of the guys, Dan Pierce, he went on and he kept doing designs that were based on the Lab Series designs. And if you see a Pierce amp, you'll see they have these exact same knobs on them, which these knobs come from Moog synthesizers. So again, that's a Moog touch, or these knobs are shaped and look like this. So the Pierce amplifiers are basically this channel, but two of them, and they're in a rack, and there's one on top of the other, except they have more gain and more options. So you kind of have a clean and a dirty, and there's channel switching, but it still has the same compressor and other things on there, but just a lot more flexibility. And those amps can be found all the time in the $800, $1,000 range. The Lab amps, tend to be in the $400 to $1,000 range also. So they're both out there. Of course, and the Pierce amps were available only from about the mid 80s to the early 90s. And there was the Mark 1, and then they had the G1, then the G2, and then there was a G3 that was very short lived that had a third acoustic channel, I believe. There were a bunch of different Lab Series models. The most popular was the L5 that had 212s, and it was like a twin. You had the L9 that had the single 15 EV in it. Then you also had the L7, which was 410s, like a super reverb. Then there were bass amps, and there was a L11 head. There was a keyboard amp that was called the K5, and there were a bunch of different models. But unfortunately they went away. But they're great amps, and they are still out there. They're because they sold a lot of them, you can find them on Craigslist or Reverb and such. The problem with these is that one more thing I should say about the models. There's a small L3 model. That's a cool little amp. The problem is that it doesn't have any of the special features that the bigger amps have. It doesn't have the frequency and mid-range thing, and it doesn't have the compressor on there, which kind of, it makes it just a good little amp, but it's like, why not get a PV amp at that point? Again, nothing wrong with the PV, but I mean, the L3, it's just a good little amp that might be good for testing stuff. In fact, I think down at Exact Tone Solutions, they have an old Lab L3 that they use for testing purposes. But the problem with these amps is that they're heavy. They're very heavy, and so this one, between 50 and 60 pounds. It's the size of about a super reverb, and it's got a 15-inch EV, which is a lot of the weight there, but also the weight of the big heat sinks and the big transformer that it has. Because I mean, this is old school, high-end transistor technology, and so. It's not lightweight. They're all over the place. You can find them. The negative is just the weight. Now for the story about me getting this one. So I, of course, started using Lab amps in the 90s. And at one point, the first one that I had was an L5, and I bought it at Nashville Used Music here in town. And I used that, and then I found the L9, which is what I wanted in the first place, because I wanted to be like Ray Flacke and Ricky Skaggs. And so I got an L9 and then I got a second L9. So I had two L9s, and most of the time I would just gig with one of them, but there were at times I would take both of them and I would gig with two L9s if it were like a big outdoor thing. And I love the amp. And in fact, I used to, I used to put pedals in front of it, which it handles pedals fine. And other times, if it was just a straight country, old school kind of gig, I would Velcro a deluxe memory man on top of it. And there's an accessory outlet back here. And it was one of those, 90s deluxe memory mans with the hardwired 3-prong cable. And I would just plug it into the back, and I'd plug into the deluxe memory man, and then I had a little cable run in there. So basically I could just carry the amp on stage, put it down, plug it in, and I'd be ready to go, and I could play the gig. I thought I was a cool guy for some reason doing that. So I used the amps a lot. Then, I started working for Brad and started doing some other things. I just kind of got out of them, and they were big, and I wasn't really gigging much in the early 2000s. When I was, it was like, I was getting to play the Opry and other things, but you don't get to take your own amp when you're doing that. And so they were just kind of sitting around, and so I sold them off. Well, in the last 10 years, I kind of decided I wanted to find another one. But the problem is that shipping is expensive. And so a lot of times these amps are, in the $500 to $800 range, but then they want $150 to ship, which is fair because it's a heavy amp and that's just what it costs. So I was kind of the opinion that, okay, I'm going to wait until one shows up locally, because it was like ones would show up like in Atlanta or places like that. And I was like, no, I'm not going to drive, a couple hundred miles to get an amplifier. So just a couple days ago, I had some friends in town, and we had gone to Grimey's Records, which is a nationwide, famous vinyl record shop here in Nashville. It's a great place, and they also have a lot of music books and stuff like that, and I enjoy going there. We went there, and there's also a used clothing place behind it, vintage clothing, which of course means it's used clothing that's expensive, which I get it. I'm into vintage guitars. I understand used clothing being expensive, but one of my friends wanted to get a bargain, which meant you need to go to a thrift store. And so they found a thrift store that was on Nolensville Road. And I was like, uh-oh, I'm in trouble, because I was thinking, I think this thrift store is next to Nashville Used Music. Now, just to give without going, get too long-winded, if you're ever in Nashville and you want good international food, if you're wanting like Indian, Mexican, Lebanese, Ethiopian, anything like that, Greek, Kurdish, whatever, you go to Nolensville Road. I mean, that's where all the good ethnic food is. That's where you go. That's where you go to get tacos. And also, that's where the good thrift stores are, and there's some good music stores. And so the best music store on Nolensville Road is Nashville Used Music. And so as soon as we, started getting close to this thrift store, yes, it was in the same shopping center as Nashville Used Music. And part of me just said, they're going to have a Lab Series L9. They're going to have it. And so everyone else is going into the thrift store, and I say, hey, I'm going to go into the music shop. Well, I go in, and of course I look through the used pedals, which they have a lot of great used pedals. That's one of the reasons I like the shop. And they've got really helpful guys working there, guys and gals. And I start going down, the aisles, and there it is. This amp right here, sitting there. And I was just like, oh crap. It was like, it won't, I was happy, but also I was like, oh, this thing weighs a ton. And it's like, now I'm finally going to get it. And it was a good price. And so I played through it. And here's where I was a big dummy. So I was playing through it, and I turned the compressor, the knob, all the way up. And I started playing it, and it wasn't lighting up. And so I thought the compressor wasn't working. So I go over to the guy and gal working behind the counter, and I say, hey, I'm interested in this amp, and except, the compressor's not working on it. Wondering if you can give me a deal on it. And then I find out that one of the guys, watches my show, and that I had met him in the store earlier. And so he says, "Are you sure the compressor's not working?" And I said, "Yeah." I said, "I've owned, a couple of these in the past. I know these amps. I used to gig with them. And the compressor doesn't work." So he says, "Well, let me see what kind of wiggle room we have on the amp." And so he takes some money off, and I buy the amp, and I lug it across the the parking lot, which again, this thing weighs a ton. And I get it home, and I start playing through it, and I start messing with the compression knob, and then I realize, oh boy howdy, I just goofed. The compressor works fine. It was me. It was pilot error. So I know one of the guys that works there, and I had his phone number, and so his name is Johnny Isaacs, and he's a great guy. He's a great player. I think I met him back in Texas when he lived there, and I texted him and I told him, and I said, "Look, I kind of pushed on the price because I said the compressor wasn't working, and then I found out it actually does work." And he said, "What do we need to do?" And he said, "Well, they've got some wiggle room on price, but it would be appreciated if you gave the store a plug on your show." So I thought that was the least I could do for them. So here's my plug, which, it's totally honest. I love Nashville Used Music. It's down on Nolensville Road. It's a great used and new shop. They're a great dealer for True Tone. I've bought all sorts of things from them through the years. They were there before I moved to Nashville in the early 90s. They have great, knowledgeable staff, great people there. And I've bought multiple Lab Series amps from them through the years, and all sorts of other guitars and strings and pedals and stuff. And they're just a really great shop. And, anytime you're in Nashville, you need to go to Nashville Used Music, and you need to go buy a taco truck, or, El Tapatio #2 is my favorite taco place. It's a little further up. And so what you need to do is you need to either, if you start from the south, you start at Nashville Used Music, then you go up north to El Tapatio #2, get you some tacos. I like the El Pastor the best, and then you can go up and hit a record shop or something like that, and just have a good time. So there you have it. So Nashville Used Music, great shop. And I apologize to them for my pilot error and for them being kind to me. And so that's my plug. So there you have it. All right. So I hope you've enjoyed my look at the Lab Series amps. This one I got, and I totally cleaned it up and colored in, some of the missing black that was on the faceplate, and of course blew out all the dust. And I always enjoyed doing that. But this amp works great. Again, I've got some knobs coming, and let's see if it ends up out on the road at some point. All right, guys. Well, I hope you've enjoyed today's episode, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.